Hi guys, and welcome to another iOS development tutorial. So in this tutorial we're going to be looking at UI text fields and how you can use them to both display a particular type of keyboard and also look at the actions that we have to take in our code to be able to dismiss that keyboard. So I've created a sample application and I've got it up on our simulator, and you'll notice that it has 4 UI text fields. Now when I tap into the first UI text field, I get a standard keyboard, or I'm sorry, I get a decimal keyboard, so that allows me to enter sort of decimal values if I like, or floating point values, whatever you want to call them. The second keyboard is actually the standard keyboard, and I can just enter standard stuff. And the third keyboard is what we call the email keyboard, where I've got this sort of @ sign where I could actually enter an email address. And then the fourth one is just what we call a number pad, so it just allows you to enter integer values. So the first and the fourth option are sort of useful examples that when you are creating let's say an application where you want to restrict the type of values that the user can enter. So you don't want them to be able to enter any kind of text in this particular field. Perhaps you're doing some kind of a conversion from let's say Fahrenheit to Celsius, and you want them to be able to enter sort of this floating point value but only enter numbers, and then you can then grab this value and then perform whatever calculations you want with this. We're also going to take a look at how you can dismiss the keyboard, because having a display on screen when you tap into a UI text field is actually handled by iOS itself, so you don't have to write any kind of special code to be able to do that, but you do have to implement some code to be able to dismiss the keyboard. So let's take a look at the different examples here. So you'll notice that in the first UI text field, like I said, we're displaying a decimal pad, and that doesn't actually have a return button. In fact, this is just going to clear out these values. Instead, what the user might expect to be able to do is hit this OK button to dismiss the keyboard. And as you can see in this application, we've got it set up so it can do that. The user might also expect to be able to just tap away from this text field and dismiss it. We've got that set up as well. Now, in the case of the second text field, we've got the standard keyboard, and it does have a return button. So if I were a user, I would expect to be able to hit the return button and dismiss the keyboard. Same goes for the third one. And then again, in the case of the fourth one, again, there is no return button, so I should be able to hit OK and dismiss it. So let's take a look at how we can easily implement the different kinds of UI keyboards. There's actually quite a few other options in addition to the ones that I just showed you on screen, and we'll take a look at some of those, and we'll also take a look at what you have to do to be able to dismiss the keyboard. So let's get started. So I'm going to move my simulator off screen, and let's see if we can't it's my organizer, so I'm just going to go to File, New Project, and we can hide away the organizer itself, and let me drag my project window to the center. And so I'm under iOS application. I'm going to select single view application and hit next, and I'm just going to call this keyboard example app. And just to note that I've got device family set to iPhone, which is no problem, and I do not have use storyboards check, so we're not going to use that. We do have use automatic reference counting check. We do want that. I'm going to hit next. It's going to ask me where I'd like to create this. I'll just save it on my desktop, and we'll let it go here. Okay, fantastic. Now as I expand this project, xCode will of course try to do some kind of scanning and indexing, and we'll give it a few seconds to finish that up, and it looks like it's just about done. And once that's done, we're actually going to start in our view controller's nib file. And what we're going to do here, of course, is drag a couple UI text fields to our view here. So if you don't have this particular objects library visible, it's because your utilities view is hidden away. So you just need to push this particular button to make sure it's displayed. Great. So we're going to come down here and try to find our text field, and there it is. So we're just going to drag one to our view here, and I might make this a little bit bigger so we can kind of see it. Now I actually want 4 UI text fields, so the easiest way to do that, instead of dragging 4 of these, is just to select the first one, keep your option key pressed down, and then just sort of drag to drag a third one, and it gives you these nice little grid lines to make sure they're aligned. 2, 3, and 4. Okay, and maybe we'll space this apart just a little bit so they're not that close to you. Didn't mean to do that. Give some room. Okay, now that this is done, I want to point out the fact that each UI text field has a bunch of different properties, and turns out that you can actually set some of these within Interface Builder as well. So one of the things we're going to affect is the keyboard, but we're going to try and do that programmatically, and we're not going to do it here in Interface Builder, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing it right here. You can set this value, and it'll then show up as a particular type of keyboard. I'm not sure if there's a complete list here. I don't think this is all of the values, so sometimes you can't get every single one if you try to do it from here. So that's why we're going to try to learn how to do it programmatically. Okay, so with this set, what I want to be able to do, of course, is affect this keyboard, affect the UI keyboard that's displayed when I click into this text field. So what I want is to create outlets for each of these text fields, and you may want to do that anyway, because if you're creating an application where you want to be able to pull this value or interact with this particular text field, then you will want that outlet. So of course the easiest way to do that is to pull up the assistant editor, which is just this middle button under the editor group of buttons that looks like a tuxedo, and we'll make some room for ourselves here. And then what I'm going to do is select my first field and then right click and drag a connection here to my view controller file. I'm just going to call this something simple like text field 1. Hit connect, and let's do the others real quick as well. This is going to be text field. I'm just going to command C that. Hit connect and right click and drag a connection here. I'm just going to just field 3, hit connect, and then text field 4. Connect. Okay, fantastic. So let's go back to our standard editor. I'm going to do a command save, always save your work, and then jump back into our view controllers implementation file. And then you'll of course notice that it's already done all the add property and add synthesize stuff for us. And what we're going to do here is come down to our view.load method, and then we're just going to say display different UI keyboards. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start off by saying text field 1 dot, it has a keyboard type property, and you see that comes right up. We're going to set its keyboard type to UI keyboard, and then you'll notice that there's quite a few UI keyboards you can set this to. So I'm going to set the first one to default, and this is sort of unnecessary because it's going to default to the default anyway, and we don't really need to do that. But I'm just, since this is an exercise, I'm going to explicitly state it there, and I'm going to set the second one to be UI keyboard type email address. We'll set the third one to be keyboard type to be, let's pick the UI keyboard number pad, and here we are. And then last one, which is text field 4, we're going to set its keyboard type to be UI keyboard decimal pad. Great. Alright, with this done, let's just quickly run our application and see what we've got. Give the simulator a few seconds to come up on screen. And here we go. See if I can help this along. There we go. Alright, so we've got our 4 different UI text fields. You'll notice when I tap into the first field, I get the standard or the default UI keyboard. Tap into the second one, I get the email. And this is all completely based on what we've entered here. I tap on the third one, and I actually get this number pad, which allows me to enter only integer values. And then the fourth one, where I get a decimal pad, where I could enter something like 25.45 or something like that. And like I said earlier, this is really useful if you're building an application that's doing maybe some kind of a conversion, maybe it's Fahrenheit to Celsius, and you only want to allow the user to enter either integer values or these kind of floating point or decimal values, whatever have you. So one of the problems we have here at this point in our application development is that we have no way of dismissing this keyboard. So once it appears on screen, which like I said, once you tap into a particular UI text field, iOS handles the displaying of the keyboard, but it requires you to implement the code for when you want it to be dismissed. So you'll notice here that there's a return button in the case of the first and the second UI text fields, but tapping it does nothing. In the case of the third and fourth, which is our number pad and decimal pad, there isn't even a return button. So you really have to implement some mechanism to do that. Now, if you remember our basic application, we had a couple different buttons that we had set up here, and you might expect that to be the case in a lot of these different applications. The user might expect to see a button that does something or is, says calculate or OK or done or something, and when you tap that, the user will expect that the keyboard will disappear. We can also expect that when the user is working with a standard keyboard or an email pad or email address type UI keyboard, they would expect this return button to dismiss the keyboard. So let's start with that as a first example. We will implement some code that allows us to dismiss the keyboard when the user taps the return button. So I'm going to stop my application, and I'm going to jump back to my view controller's nib file. So if we remember, it's only the first and the second text fields that generate keyboards with return buttons in them. So we can very easily just right click on this particular UI text field and look for the delegate option here, and then just drag a connection from that to files owner. So basically what we're saying here, of course, is that files owner will act as the delegate for this particular UI text field. Do that again on the second one. We don't really need to do it on the other two because of the fact that they don't have return keys, but it doesn't hurt to do it. So let's just go ahead and do it anyway, in case we decide down the line that we want to change the type of keyboard that's displayed. We'll already have all the proper code in place to allow it to work with that return. Okay, so we've got all four of these set up. What we have to do next is jump into our view controller.h file, and what we have to do here is we have said that this particular class, which is view controller, will act as the delegate for our text field. And turns out that there is an actual delegate that we can set it to be. So we'll say UITextField, and we will tell it to act as the delegate for our UITextField class. Great. So what we can do here now is take a look at the different methods that are available to us as part of being a delegate. So if I click into this, you'll notice that in the quick help I get a referenced link, and I'm going to click on that, so bring it up in Organizer. And you'll notice that the UITextField delegate protocol reference has a couple different methods that we can implement. So the one that we're actually looking for is this one right here. It's just a different color because I clicked on it earlier, and it's called text field should return. So let me click on that and take a look at what it actually does. So it asks the delegate if the text field should process the pressing of the return button. It has a parameter of text field. It returns a value of either yes or no, so that's important to note. And then if you look at the discussion itself, this can be sort of useful in telling you exactly what this method does. So this method is called whenever the user taps the return button, and you can use this method to implement any custom behavior when the button is tapped. So this is where we would implement our code to actually dismiss the keyboard. Great. So what I'm going to do is copy this method signature, do a Command C, and then minimize this and come back to my implementation file, and let's just make some room at the end here and paste that in. Excellent. And we'll do Command S to save. Okay, so first thing we want to do, of course, is remember this method needs to return either a yes or a no, and I'm just going to set this to return a yes. And that'll get rid of the warning because it's now returning a value. But that's not actually enough to dismiss the keyboard. Now let's just sort of take a quick segue and think about how iOS is dealing with the text fields and things like that. So as we noticed earlier, when you tap into a UI text field, the UI keyboard is automatically displayed. And turns out you don't have to write any code to actually make the keyboard to display, which is pretty sweet because iOS handles that. What it does expect you to do is type in the code necessary or implement the methods necessary to dismiss it. Now, when a UI text field is tapped and the UI keyboard comes up, the UI text field that resulted in that keyboard being displayed becomes what's called the first responder, and that's a term that you'll want to remember. So the text field, again to recap, the text field that was tapped to bring up the keyboard is the first responder. So that's whatever the last text field you tapped was. So in the case of our other application, if you remember, we had 4 text fields, and if I tapped the first one and the keyboard came up, and then I tapped the second one and the keyboard came up, whatever I tapped last, whichever UI text field I tapped last, is the first responder. So what we would do here is we would make use of the fact that we are passing in a text field object, and we would simply say text field, and this is text field and not text field 1, 2, 3, or 4, because we're actually referring to this particular parameter, and we would tell it to resign its first responder status by calling that method. Command S to save. Let's run this application, and you'll see that in the case of the first two UITextFields, where we did get a return button in our keyboard, we now have the ability to dismiss that keyboard. So give it a couple seconds here to pull up. I've got a bunch of different applications running, and so that's why it takes a little bit longer. Okay, so here we go. So I tap into the first text field, and there we go. We have a return button, and I can hit it, and it dismisses the keyboard. Second one, hit it, and it dismisses the keyboard. Third and fourth ones, of course, there is no return button, which means we have to implement a different mechanism to be able to dismiss that. Now, you notice that I tapped into the third one, tapped into the fourth one, and changed the keyboard. Now, when I tap into the first one again, I get the return button, and this is what I was trying to illustrate earlier, or explain earlier. Although I may have 4 different keyboards, so let me jump back. I'm going to go back to the first one, hit return, dismiss it. I'm going to now jump into the fourth one, and you'll notice that there's no return button, so I'll go back to the first one. And even though I started with the fourth keyboard at this point, and then I selected the first one, the first text field is now the first responder, and I can hit return to dismiss it. So that's what I meant earlier when I said it's whatever the last text field you tapped was. That's the first responder, and that's important to know. All right, so let's implement some other methods to actually dismiss the keyboards. So in our example application, you may remember that I had a bunch of different buttons here, and that's what we're going to implement next is those different buttons, because a user interface might very well have a button next to each UI text field, and so that's something standard where the user would expect to be able to tap that and dismiss the keyboard. All right, so let's stop this application, and I'm going to come back to my view controller's nib file, and I'm going to find myself a round rect button. Just drag that up here, and maybe we'll scale this down just a little bit, and we'll just say OK in there. Let that go. And then I'm going to use the same option I did earlier to duplicate this. So I am going to select that particular UI button or round rect button, and then just depress the Option key on my keyboard, and then just drag a copy down, do it a couple more times, and there we go. Command S. Perfect. So what we're going to do now is affect a property that is available to every object that we drag onto our view. So if I select my UI button, the first one, and I take a look at this identity inspector, or I'm sorry, the attributes inspector within our utilities view, if I scroll down here, you'll see a section called view, and then you'll see a property called tag. So what we have the ability to do is give each of these objects a particular tag value, and I'm going to set this first buttons to be 1. I'm going to set the second one to be 2, third one to be 3, and then the fourth one to be 4. Great. Now, what I also want to do is I need to be able to create some kind of an IB action that will fire when this button is tapped. So the easiest way to do that, of course, is again to bring up our assistant editor. And then I'm going to select the first button, and then right click and then drag a connection here. And it's going to ask me, do I want it to be an outlet? No, I actually want it to be an action. And I'm going to call this action something simple like dismiss keyboard, and then I'm going to hit connect and do a Command S to save and go back to my standard editor. Now what I'm actually going to do is, instead of doing that over and over again for the other 3 buttons, I'm actually going to connect these 3 buttons all to files owner. So what I did is I selected it, right clicked it, and dragged the connection, and I'm going to connect it to that exact same IB action, which is dismiss keyboard. So let's do it for the remaining 4. And the reason I'm doing this is so that I don't have to create, 4 separate methods that essentially do the same thing, which is they dismiss the keyboard. Instead, I'm going to use that one method that we created and put some conditional code in there, or some conditional logic in there, to be able to distinguish between the different buttons and then dismiss the appropriate keyboard. All right, so here's our method that we created called dismiss keyboard. I'm going to come down here. Now, this dismiss keyboard method is going to be, it has one parameter. It's called ID and then sender. ID is just a generic object type, and then sender is the name of the parameter, and is there to represent the object that sent that information. So one of our dilemmas here, of course, is, well, how do we know which of the buttons actually is firing this method? And it's important for us to know which of the buttons it is, because we're going to need to know which text field was the first responder. So there's a couple different ways to do this, and one of the ways we're going to take a look at here is we're going to leverage that. If you remember, when we had set this, we had set the tag value for each of these buttons to 1, 2, 3, and 4, so on and so forth. We're going to leverage that fact. So let's jump back in here. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a switch statement. And within the switch statement, it of course takes an integer value. I'm going to say sender, and I'm going to access its tag property. Right? And I could just as easily do this as sender.tag if I wanted to use .syntax, sender.tag, and that should work just fine as well. So I'm going to change that back to sender tag, Command S, and let's come back down here and say, okay, so our first case will be case 1, because that's where our values start. And what we're going to do is case 1 is of course tied to the first button, which we happen to know is text field 1. So what we'll do here is we'll say something like text field 1. We'll ask text field 1 to resign its first responder, Command S to save. And then I'm just going to go ahead and copy this a couple different times, and I'll get errors, of course. Whoops, not what I wanted to copy. Command C to copy. Try that again, because I'm doing a case redeclaration, so I need to change that to 2, and we'll need to change this to 2 as well. Come back down. This will be case 3, and last but not least, case 4. Command S to save. And now let's run our application, and we should find that we now have a OK button that's next to or adjacent to each of our text fields, and that we can actually dismiss that value as needed. Okay, so here's our text field. If I hit the OK button, that goes away. Here's the second one. Hit the OK button, that disappears. So there we go. We've now implemented a mechanism that is recognizable to the user, where they know to tap this button and they will expect the keyboard to disappear once they're done typing in their values, and it does just that. Okay, and so we've got our 2 out of our 3 methods of dismissing the keyboard. So our final one is, if you remember, we had talked about how a user might expect to be able to tap, once they've brought up the keyboard, to be tap away from that particular text field and also dismiss the keyboard. So let's implement some code to allow us to do just that. So I'm going to stop this application, and what we're going to do is jump back into our view controllers nib file, and I'm going to find again the round rect button and just drag one onto my view, and then I'm going to drag this out just a little bit so it encompasses the entire, just covers up the entire view. Of course, I can't see any of my other objects, so one of the things I could do is I could either bring this up here and then just reorder this by dragging it all the way to the top. So in this particular stack, if it's all the way at the top, it's actually all the way behind, so I can get to the other values. I could also use my editor, and there's an option called sent back that I could use. So it's like editor, and then it's under, I believe, under arrange sent back. So this would be highlighted if I had the right value. Right object selected. Okay, so we've got that set up anyway, and at this point, the one other thing that we need to do is we want to change this button's type to be custom, and that'll make it, transparent. Great. Now what we also want to do is create an IB action that we can tie this button to. So I'm going to select the button, pull up the assistant editor, then select the button, and then just drag a connection here. It's going to ask me what I want, not an outlet but an action, and I'm going to call this with a very similar name. We're going to call this dismiss keyboard, and we'll just call this dismiss keyboard with BB standing, to represent blank button. Let's go back to our standard editor, do a Command S to save, and jump back into our view controllers implementation file. Okay, so here's our last method here that we need to implement. And what we're going to do here is, again, we need to be able to know which of the text fields was the one that is the first responder for our UI keyboard. So the way we're going to do it here actually is we're going to say if, we're going to do a bunch of if statements. So in this conditional statement we're going to say if, we're going to say sender. Oh, actually we're going to say, we can just say if text field 1 is first responder. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a couple different checks. We're going to say if the first text field is the first responder, then what we want to do is we want it to resign its first responder status. So we'll do a Command C, paste that there, and then I'm just going to copy and paste this a couple more times, and we will change this to be text field 2, text field 2, text field 3, text field 3, text field 4, text field 4. So the reason we're using it in this manner is because in this case the ID sender parameter would really represent the blank button, and that's not really going to help us. But what we can do is check to see if our first text field is currently the first responder. So we do that for each of our different text fields, and of course this is not necessarily ideal because it has to go through every iteration of this particular value. So it'll basically check this, then the third, and then the fourth one. But it does do the job, and we can resign the first responder. So now let's run our application one last time, and you'll notice that we do have all three mechanisms using which we can then essentially dismiss the keyboard, and we'll give it a couple seconds here, and it should be coming up any second now. Great. So now we've got this mechanism. As you remember, if I tap into the first particular text field, I can type some stuff in, hit return, and that dismisses it. If I use the fourth one and I type in some value here, I can hit OK and dismiss it, and then now you'll see that I can type some stuff in here, and then I can just click outside and it would dismiss the keyboard again. So hopefully this has shown you the different methods using through which you can actually dismiss the keyboard, and also hopefully this tutorial has been a good example in showing you how you can bring up different kinds of keyboards based on what you need the user to enter in the text field. So thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in another tutorial.